Welcome to Spicer and Company. I'm Sean Spicer.
And I'm Lindsay Keith. You know, Sean, it's been 10 days since the tragic killing of George Floyd, and it still feels like we're nowhere close to getting answers of how to move forward as a country.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot has really transpired in the 10 days since then. The officer that killed him was arrested pretty much right after that happened, and the charges against him have now grown since the initial arrest. The three other officers that stood by and just watched this all happen, well, they've been arrested now, and I'm pretty certain that there's universal outrage at what occurred that day. But since then, we've seen peaceful protests turning to rioting, destruction, and looting. Protesting and demanding change, that's part of who we are as America. That's part of what makes us great. But the rioting and the looting, the vandalism, the destruction and the killing, that's not us. So I think it's time that we started asking this question: where do we go from here, and how do we get there? I mean, the question, right, is that's easy. Everyone can throw that out. Here's the question that we need to do, blah, blah, blah. But answering it, that's where I think this is going to get a bit complicated. And if there's a doubt in your mind about the need for the urgency in coming up with a solution, I want you to listen to this.
So some coward fired shots at officers, and now we have 4 in the hospital. But thankfully, and thank God, they're alive. They're alive. But can we make some sense out of this? Can we make some sense out of this? That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. That was St. Louis Police Chief John Hayden. He's talking about 4 police officers that were shot by rioters. They represent just a fraction of the more than 300 officers injured nationwide. And that doesn't even include the 50 Secret Service officers that were injured here in Washington, D.C. Back in St. Louis, this is a heart-wrenching story. There was a 38-year veteran of the police force, retired Captain David Dorn. He was killed when he went out to check on his friend's pawn shop and looters shot him. I don't know how to explain that. Meanwhile, the looters and the rioters who've been arrested were released without any criminal charges by St. Louis prosecutor Kim Gardner. And the Missouri State Attorney General, Eric Schmitt, says more can be done to prosecute these bad actors. So let's bring him in, the Attorney General of Missouri, Eric Schmitt. Mr. Attorney General, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So first of all, tell me how these officers are doing. And I know this sounds weird, but is there anything being done to honor, to recognize him and to recognize Captain Dorn for his service?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, it was a Monday night was an incredibly difficult night in St. Louis. Those images that the whole world saw, certainly the country and here in Missouri, looked like a war zone. I mean, you had police officers being shot at, 4 were injured. Thankfully, none of those 4 died. There was a highway patrolman who had a bullet lodged in his helmet. You had businesses that were being burned to the ground. You had firefighters being assaulted and blocked from doing their job. And then, of course, Captain Dorn, who'd served this community for decades, mentored youth, was a very respected police officer in St. Louis and served this community, was murdered on Facebook Live and people celebrating. And so really despicable acts. And we just can't accept that kind of level of violence. We really can't. And so we announced yesterday that we had discovered that the circuit attorney, the local prosecuting attorney, after all these folks had been arrested, they're all released. They were all released back out onto the street. And so it's incredibly tragic. And to answer your question too, Captain Dorn is being honored in many different ways here in the St. Louis area and universally respected. His wife, his widow, is actually still with the police force. And so our hearts go out to them and his entire family. We pray for them, but we've got to step back from the brink as these events that unfolded in St. Louis and across the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to break down, and I'm glad that you guys are honoring Captain Dorn. I mean, I saw the anguish in the chief's face, in his voice. I mean, this is turned into something that was supposed to honor the life of George Floyd, and now we're pitting people against each other. And I guess as the Attorney General, President Obama last night or yesterday talked about some things that need to be done. One of them is he asked mayors and community leaders to look at how they're policing. Is that something that you as the Attorney General can help facilitate in Missouri?
Well, we certainly want to be part of the conversation, and there are big and important discussions to be had. I guess just to take a step back, here in Missouri, 5+6 years ago, we dealt with Ferguson. And in the aftermath of Ferguson, in that instance, what we found, the St. Louis region is a little bit different, but there are 90 different municipalities in St. Louis County. And what we discovered was that a lot of city bureaucrats in those municipalities, hungry for revenue, were treating people as ATMs. And so, you had a process which we called taxation by citation. So we reined in those cities from seeking that revenue source, which was breaking down trust in the community. And since then, that situation has improved. That's not the only thing to do, but it's an example of things that can be done when people work together. As you mentioned, there's a conversation to be had, but as we see this level of violence, as we saw on Monday, when you see police officers being shot at, when you see firefighters being assaulted, when you see a retired police captain being murdered defending property, we need to make sure those people are being brought to justice, which is why the revelation that every single person arrested that night was set free,
right,
and no charges were brought, is very disturbing.
So can I ask you about that? Because we don't have a ton of time left, but St. Louis prosecutor Kim Gardner, you mentioned that. She responded. You were critical of releasing all of those people. She didn't prosecute a single one of them. This is what her response was to you.
I've noticed that the Attorney General is tweeting quite a bit about looters and rioters, and not about the fact that we have a history of police violence in the city and nation. It is clear that he does not care about justice or safety or needs of this community. He just wants to launch a politically motivated attack against me, even if it means misleading and lying to the public.
So is there anything to that? I mean, my understanding is you were critical of the fact that 36 people were arrested and not one was charged. What is it that she seems to have a beef with here?
I don't know. We were just asking her to do her job, that, these folks were arrested and they were all released, and there were no charges. Everyone was released. There was no charges that could be brought. I find that hard to believe. But look, what my job as Attorney General, as the Chief Legal Officer for the state of Missouri, is to stay focused on public safety. My job is to protect the 6 million citizens that I represent, which is why we've entered into a very unique partnership with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We are working with federal law enforcement to prosecute looters and rioters here in Missouri. We're going to do that work. We've already announced our own arrests on that front. But certainly what happened Monday night is inexcusable. We called out the local prosecuting attorney on that, rightfully so. But we're going to continue to do our work. We're going to stay focused on protecting the public. They deserve that, and that's my job.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you joining us and sharing that insight. I hope things go better in St. Louis and that you continue to honor the service of Captain Dorn. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. So what's that line that needs to be drawn between these constitutionally protected protests that we talk about and the criminal activities that have turned into riots? Well, here to answer that, we're going to bring in the former governor of Missouri, Eric Greitens, and the former attorney general of Florida and special advisor to President Trump, Pam Bondi. All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. I think the first thing I want to ask you, though, is we've seen the officer was arrested that did this. They've increased the charges. The 3 other officers were arrested. And obviously, we'll see if justice is done in the court system. But, Governor, let me start with you. What is the way forward in kind of healing the country?
Heal the country is that we need to restore law and order. There has to be peace in order for us to heal. And we need to have mayors and governors step forward to create that peace so that healing can happen. Unfortunately, in places like Missouri, you saw David Dorn, retired police captain, who was murdered by rioters and looters. We had 4 police officers who were shot the other night. Another police officer last night. We need to create peace. And if we can create peace, then there will be a time and a place and a space for people to come together and to create that kind of healing.
Attorney General Bondi, what needs to happen? You've prosecuted a lot of folks. You've seen big issues in Florida. What are you recommending that we need to do?
Well, first of all, Sean, Missouri is so blessed to have my friend Eric Schmitt as their Attorney General, because I prosecuted before I was Attorney General, and that state prosecutor, she should be ashamed of herself for what she said and did. She needs to support not only that what happened to George Floyd was horrible, and what happened to those other police officers and David Dorn was horrible. She should be saying Captain Dorn's name just as much instead of criticizing General Schmitt. And, you know, Sean, what needs to happen is what General Schmitt said and what the governor just said. You know, they need to move forward in a safe way. And that's why I'm so proud of our commander-in-chief, President Trump, for offering the services of the National Guard, of the military, of anyone who needs to come forward and help these states. And Chief Hayden made some really remarkable statements when he said he welcomed any support to Missouri to help them. You know, there was total chaos. And the governor just talked about all those officers who got shot, which was horrible. They were throwing gas on police officers and then throwing fireworks at them. So there could have been a mass murder of police officers during these protests that were far from peaceful. And, you know, Chief Hayden also said, and by the way, he's a black police chief. How do we reconcile the death of George Floyd with breaking into businesses? How is stealing and looting in any way going to help the death of George Floyd? So it's horrible what happened, but I'm proud of our president and I'm proud of our attorney general for stepping up and doing everything they can to keep Missouri and all of the people there safe.
Governor, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you this quickly. We keep having people on the left saying the way to move forward is to vote the right folks into office. But when you see people like Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi who've been in office for decades but haven't made real change to systemic issues, who are the right people to help us move forward and to heal, like you mentioned?
Well, I think most importantly, the right people are going to be people who aren't afraid to have the backs of our law enforcement officers when things get tough. It's when things are hard that we need to have leaders who step forward and are strong to support our law enforcement officers. And, you know, President Trump was exactly right when he said there are too many mayors and too many governors who've been weak on this, who've allowed looting, who've allowed burning, who've allowed attacks on police officers. We need to get out there and to support people who are going to support our law enforcement officers, not just in words, but get out there and be on the front lines when things are hard.
Guys, thank you both for being here. Governor General Bondi, thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words during this time. All right, coming up, best-selling author, entrepreneur, and podcaster David Harris Jr. is defending President Trump's reaction to the killing of George Floyd. He's blasting left-leaning media outlets and Democrats for insinuating that Floyd's death is somehow now Trump's fault. And later, we've got Congressman Lee Zeldin coming up. He's going to discuss the latest between President Trump and military leaders over the handling of violent protests. All that and more, so stick around.